What's happening, everybody, and welcome back to the Chaplaincy on the Go podcast. I'm your host, Josh Zorhoff. I'm a teaching pastor and a counselor in the West Michigan area. And this podcast is brought to you by the Fearless family of churches. And we're excited to share with you a new episode today with an author by the name of David Thomas. David Thomas has been working in the therapy realm for over 20 years, and he specifically works with young boys. I stumbled on to David's work a number of years ago when I read his book, Wild Things: The Art of Nurturing Boys. And it's a really great book. It actually walks through the developmental ages and stages of a young boy's life. The other book that he's written is How to Raise Emotionally Strong Boys, and he has a ton of information to share with us. So if you are a father or a mother of a young boy, or you yourself as a man want to learn more about what it means to express your emotions in a healthy way, or how to deal with stress, or how to deal with other emotional issues in your life, this is going to be a really important conversation. But let me just say, for moms and for wives, this is going to be an important conversation as well, because David Thomas unpacks something really important to think about when we consider how men process their emotions as young children with the mothers in their life, and then sometimes transfer that to their girlfriends or their wives. And it's a conversation with a term he calls anchoring. And we're going to get into that. And so I want you to pay attention to what he has to say. There's a lot that he's got to offer us, and we're going to jump into that conversation right now. Well, all right, here we are with David Thomas, the author of Raising Emotionally Strong Boys. And he's not only the author of that, he is also the author of a book called Wild Things, which if you haven't read that, that's a fantastic book that breaks down a lot of the developmental stages for boys. But David, I'm going to give you a chance to just introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you and what you're doing right now and why this work with boys.
Well, I want to first say it is an honor to spend time with you. I'm so grateful for the good work you're doing in this world and was thrilled for you to invite me into conversation. And I was just commenting before we jumped on to say you and I are so like-minded and like-hearted, and it's an honor to share time with you. So thank you. I am first and foremost a proud son and husband and father. And in addition to those being my favorite roles, I've also had the great privilege the last 25 years of being a therapist. And I work at a really unique place called Daystar Counseling here in Nashville, Tennessee. And our whole focus is the pediatric population. That's all we do is focus on kids, adolescents, and families. And we do the work a little different in that we're in a house rather than an office building, which was a very intentional decision because if anyone listening has ever taken a kid you love to counseling, or if you've gone yourself, you know it can be an overwhelming experience, particularly in the beginning. So we do as much as we can to help folks feel safe and comfortable when they come through our doors. We currently have 5 therapy dogs on staff, which are hands down the kids' favorites. And I share that to say that I really do think, I don't mean to be braggy in saying this, but I really do think I have the best job in the world. If you get to go to work every day with kids and dogs, I just think you're knocking it out of the park. And so I have loved this work for all these decades. And out of that work, I've been given the great privilege just to write some books, as you kindly mentioned, and teach around the country, come together with parents and educators and grandparents, just folks who are so invested in the lives of young people, and talking about how can we lean in farther to better serve and steward these gifts we've been given. And so I'm incredibly grateful for that, and got an opportunity several years ago to start a podcast with my dear friend and colleague, Sissy Goff. So we have a podcast called Raising Boys and Girls, and just different ways of bringing really the learning more than anything that I've been doing through my work as a therapist, but also as a parent. There's so much learning on the job as a parent. I have long said, I think kids are such great teachers. I think it's just our job to lean in and learn from them. So I get to do that both in my life and in my work, and thankful that all that led me to a conversation with you today.
Yeah, that is such a true statement, that you can know a lot about childhood development, and you can know a lot about you can read all the books in the world, but until you raise a child, you're not really putting in that same kind of energy. And there's a lot to learn in that. As we walk through some of the books that you've written, as we walk through specifically Raising Boys, I just want to touch on Wild Things for a minute, because that was one of the first books that you put out, and that was a groundbreaking kind of piece for me to really understand the developmental stages of that boys go through. So can you talk about that just briefly?
I'd love to. I am so thankful still today. It's almost been 2 decades since I released that book, and the gift of being able to come together with a dear friend and colleague, my co-author, Stephen James. We have 5 sons between the 2 of us, and he does work with adult men, and I do, as I mentioned, work with boys and adolescent young men. And so being able to talk through the span of development, where it starts, where it ends, and speaking to it from both those unique perspectives. The thing that I found kept happening in my office over and over again, particularly when I would sit with moms who didn't grow up with brothers, who ended up being mothers of sons, and has this foreign creature in her care, and would say, like, this feels not just different to me, but like something might be off. And I loved speaking to the normal things that happen in boy development that I do think feel strange to a lot of moms, maybe not as much so to us as dads, because we've lived in that skin, and talking about, okay, here's some normal things that are happening that should be happening at this moment in development. And then going beyond that to talk about, what does he need from us? What does he need uniquely from his mom in this season, uniquely from his dad, uniquely from his teachers? And so I break down 5 stages of boy development from birth through the mid-20s in the first third of that book. And then I talk about the heart of boys and the mind of boys. And to date, my favorite compliment I've received about that book is, I had a friend years ago say to me, I purchased 10, and it's my go-to baby gift for folks at showers, because no one needs another onesie. That was her declaration. Like, no one needs another onesie, but this is the gift that I feel like we'll keep on giving. And that's just the greatest compliment I've been given, to think that this book could be a resource all throughout development for us to lean back into what's happening uniquely with boys and what do they need from us.
Yeah, probably one of the coolest stories that I could share with you is, a friend of mine read that book years ago and decided and determined that when his son was essentially of adolescent age, that pre-adolescent age, they were going to institute a weekly beer and pizza night. And he was going to have beer, and they were going to have pizza, and his son was going to have root beer. And they were going to talk about sex. They were going to talk about body changing. They were going to normalize the conversation. And the incentivizing element of that was the spinal fluid conversation that if you've not read the book, people, you need to read it just for that section, because it's hilarious. But you know what I'm talking about.
I do.
And he said, that's not going to be me. It's not going to be me. My son is going to know what becoming a man is all about. And my wife and I have actually been talking about that now. My son is of the age where his body is starting to change. And it's like, you know what? It is time to normalize the conversation, because, this is something we all go through. And yet for some reason we struggle to talk about it.
And it encourages me deeply to hear you say that. That is one of the many great hopes, is that we would normalize what's happening, that we would think more deeply about what do boys need, and equipping them all throughout the journey toward adult manhood, so that, as we think about some of these scary statistics that exist out there that we can talk more about in a few minutes for adult men, that we would have an opportunity to turn the tide in that space, that you and I, through this kind of conversation, could hopefully educate and inspire other men to think, you know what, we could do that differently. This next generation of boys could grow up understanding things about themselves, their bodies, their hearts, their relationships differently, and feeling more prepared as they take steps forward into that journey toward adult manhood.
Because it's really easy to get hung up on the statistics and then make a generalization or an assumption that, well, I mean, let's just say it, boys will be boys.
Yes.
And that we just give permission for bad behavior because we are irresponsible and, as you say, lazy in our own process of doing our own work.
Yes.
So let's talk about the statistics a little bit. Let's talk about some of the things, and then let's talk about how we maybe move into raising emotionally strong boys.
I'd love to. And you know, these statistics are not something that I even love saying out loud or saying again, because they can, I think, take us to such a place of hopelessness and despair. But I think they're important to note in order for us to be really motivated toward change. But you know, I talk in the new book about how adult men lead the stats for infidelity, internet pornography, substance abuse, and suicide. And the common denominator with all four of those being, I need someone or something to make this emotion stop. And it's an attempt to numb out or shut down whatever it is that I'm feeling. I don't have the skills in place to self-soothe in healthy, constructive ways. So I'm trying to numb out or shut down. I need something or someone to make that stop, as opposed to developing the skills to work that through. The reminder that we are made as emotional beings. We're emotional beings. And our job is simply, if I were to give, I was asked on a podcast one time, what's the Cliff Note statement of this book, what it's about? And I said, it's helping boys develop the ability to name and navigate their emotional experience.
Yes.
Because again, we're emotional beings. And as simple as that sounds, you know, according to those statistics I just shared, we're just not getting there unless folks like you and I get to talk more and talk louder about the importance of this kind of conversation. So thank you again.
Yeah. Well, I think, why is it that it is so much easier to talk about emotions with girls than it is men?
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
You know, it's interesting. I think we have long worked under a very wrong assumption that boys have fewer emotions. And I want to say right out of the gate, there is no data to support that. No data to support that. Now, what is true, and this is the difference, and I encourage folks listening, listen closely to this, boys do have fewer words. So at 16 to 18-month well visits, pediatricians would report that girls on average have about 100 words and boys have 30. And that continues throughout. So it makes sense that if her general vocabulary is larger, it makes sense that her emotional vocabulary would be larger and more expansive as well. But that simply means she has more words, not more emotions. And so what that means is he has fewer words to articulate the same emotional experience. And so we're going to have to work harder. We're going to have to labor longer on behalf of the boys we love to help them, back to the name and navigate, develop the ability to name those emotions first. And so I'm such an advocate, anyone who's ever heard me speak on boys, of grabbing hold of a feelings chart. We have them on our website, raisingboysandgirls.com. You could download one right now. And what it does is it's just expressions with the word underneath. We can use this even with kids who can't even read yet. We just point to the expression and name the feeling. And what we are doing is laying these foundational building blocks of emotional development so that when asked that question, which feels overwhelming to boys and a lot of adult men as well, like, how'd you feel about that? It turns fill in the blank into multiple choice. So it makes it easier. I don't have to come up with the word. I can simply reference the chart. And I would lastly just say the other point of having that on hand is, think for anyone listening who has, you know, a kindergartner or a first grader, think about how in every early learning environment across the globe, we have the letters of the alphabet up somewhere in the classroom, because we know that as kids see those letters when they're learning the letters, those basic foundational building blocks of reading, it strengthens the connection. This is the exact same concept. If I can just see the expression, it's going to strengthen the connection as I'm building these foundational building blocks of emotional development. So that's really where it starts. And then I think from there, you spoke beautifully to this a little bit earlier, it's all about the modeling. And
Yes.
boys need to see not just on their mothers, but on their fathers, on their grandfathers, their uncles, their coaches, all the adult men they're in close proximity to. What does it look like to navigate your emotional landscape? What does
Yep.
it look like to name your experience? And so that's in the everyday reporting. When families are sitting around the dinner table, I've laughed over the years and said, to dads, when you get asked, how was your day? I don't want you to say fine. Fine is an acronym for feelings in need of expression. That's what fine is.
Yes.
I want you to point at that chart and say things like, you know what? I felt embarrassed today. I had to give a presentation to the board of directors and I didn't feel as prepared as I wanted to. You know what? I felt sad today. I think I said something that hurt a friend or coworker's feelings. I want to circle back and check in on that. And so that modeling is where I would argue, and research supports this, boys are making the strongest connections. Kids learn more from observation than information. They learn way more from watching us than anything else. As we know, more is caught than taught. And so I want boys to get to sit front row in close proximity, not just to women, but men who are articulating their experience, knowing that those mirror neurons are firing and boys are doing all kinds of good learning in those moments.
I think that's really critical. One thing that I've shared in micro talks and in counseling sessions is that 80% of the human personality is formed by the time we are 6 years old. Like, we know who we are. We know how we fit. Like, we actually, our Enneagram typology, if you follow that, like, that is for the most part locked in by the time you are 6. And what that means, because my wife is a first grade teacher, is that means we learn who we are long before we learn to read.
Yes.
And so, like, the question is, where do we learn that from? By observation.
Yes.
By seeing the people around us interact. And so the beautiful part is that next 20% that forms over the rest of our life. So there's plenty of time to catch up and help. But for moms and dads who are listening with children who are, especially boys that are 1, 2, 3 years old, how you work through what you call recognize, regulate, recover, and repair. How you work through the R's, which I'm going to ask you to talk about in a minute, is really important, because parents, they see that in you.
Yes.
And if you have a child who is 2 or 3 and you want them to be a strong boy who is not a holy terror in their teens, now this is not a guarantee, but you have a much better shot at that if you do the hard work for yourself now.
Yes.
So talk us through the R's and how they work and why that's so critical for us as parents or us as men, and how that impacts children who are watching us.
I'd love to. And I would even say, as I introduce these 3 R's, one of the things I talk about in the beginning of this book is that to everything we're saying, we can only take the kids we love as far as we've gone ourselves. So as I talk about these 3 R's, and adults are listening, if you're thinking, ooh, I really struggle with that second one, here's good news. Even to everything you just shared, like, there is still room and space for growth. It turns out that you can indeed teach an old dog new tricks. And so there's room for growth. We now know, in terms of the architecture of the brain, that our brains are growing still all on the way. We can create new neural pathways. And so as you're listening and even thinking about what we just discussed in terms of more is caught than taught, and kids need to see this on the grown-ups see around them, that's the beginning space. So before we're going to over-focus on where our kids need to work on regulation, we're going to think, how am I doing in that space? And learning alongside kids. I wrote a workbook for elementary age boys that goes along with the parenting book, Raising Emotionally Strong Boys. And the workbook's called Strong and Smart. And I had 6 to 12-year-old boys in mind when I wrote it, though I think it's easily modified for boys kind of in the 4 and 5 space, and still could be helpful with teenagers. And I had a mom say to me recently, she said, David, I bought the workbook for my 7-year-old son. Turns out I'm mostly using it with my 37-year-old husband. And I laughed so hard when she said that. I said, well, great. I mean, he wasn't the first boy I had in mind when I wrote that, but I'm thrilled that it feels like a fit for a man of any age. So that is speaking to all this. We're all still learning. But
yeah,
all that shared to say, the 3 R's are recognize, regulate, repair. And recognize is, we tend to teach that a little bit like the dashboard of a car. I'll tell kids, start watching the dashboard in your mom or dad's car and notice how it'll send a signal if the tank is getting low and I need to add some gas, or the tires are low and I need to add some air, some air, or sometimes maybe a bigger signal like the check engine light. And so if we pay attention to those signs and signals and attend to the vehicle and those needs, then it keeps on running, generally speaking. If we ignore those, the car's going to break down. I'm going to end up on the side of the road. Turns out our bodies are a lot like that. And there's incredible truth to that wise book that was written many years ago, The Body Keeps the Score. It turns out that's 100% true. And if I, for example, carry high levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, in my system over extended periods of time, my body's going to give me a lot of signs and signals and eventually break down if I don't pay attention to those. So that first R is simply paying attention to when my body is signaling me to an emotional response. And that moves us toward the second R, which is regulate, which is employing calming and coping strategies when the nervous system goes into a heightened state of arousal. With kids, I call it getting from stress to settled, or getting from chaos to calm. And we all want to be able to travel that road, but how do I do that? And so that second R is teaching the mechanics of what regulation looks like. And then the third R is repair. And that is taking ownership and doing any needed relational work. And I talk a lot about how research supports this, and I have certainly seen it to be true in my practice, that in the face of failure, more boys tend to blame others and more girls tend to blame themselves.
Yeah.
And left to their own devices, boys will swing between that pattern of what I call blame and shame. It's like, my sister made me angry. My teacher didn't teach it the right way. The coach didn't give me enough playing time. That's blame. And then shame is self-contempt. It's
I'm a bad person.
There it is. I'm the worst kid. You wish I'd never been born. I've heard so many declarations of self-contempt, self-sabotage in those ways. And unless we teach that third R, boys don't know how to get to that healthy middle ground of ownership. They'll just swing between blame and shame. And you and I know adult males will do that as well.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And it's so interesting when you talk about seeing boys do that. I've seen that in my son. Whenever there's a stressful situation, if we get to a place where he is not satisfied with what he's getting, he will almost always move to a place of saying, this is all my fault, or I'm just a bad person, or this or that. And here's the crazy part. My wife will lean in and say, "Oh, you're not bad. Oh, yes, I am. No, you're not. Oh, yes, I am. I'm terrible." And, and this and that. And all of a sudden she gets sucked in to his stuff, because he is unwilling to do the work of regulating, and he is forcing her to regulate for him. And you have a profound term for that I think would be really helpful for some people to hear. Tell us a little bit about what that instance is called.
It's called anchoring, and it is an important topic to discuss. And I would argue, moms, you can become the primary target for a boy's anchoring. It's not to say they won't do that with dads. They certainly will. But generally speaking, boys will target moms. I think they are acutely aware that there is something that gets signaled inside a mom in dysregulated moments for a boy. And it's connected to that age-old saying of misery loves company. Anchoring is simply like, I feel yucky on the inside, and so I'd like to tie an anchor around your waist and drag you to the bottom of the lake with me. I want you to feel as yucky on the inside. And if I can convince you to somehow manage my discomfort and distress, you are doing the work of regulation for me. And I had a friend who said to me one time, I wish growing up that my mom had said to me, "You've got this," more than "let me get this for you."
Yes.
And I think there is a lot of wisdom as we think about just even the everyday of nurturing independence in our kids. Where are we doing too much? But also in terms of their emotional journey, like, where am I being your emotional resources, more than helping you develop resourcefulness, more than helping you do the work of regulation? And regulation is work. It's effortful. And that's important to note. And why so many boys, back to you kindly sharing that I call it a lazy emotional response, boys don't want to do that heavy lifting, that hard work. And so, it's like if I can get my mom to do that emotional heavy lifting, then I don't have to navigate any of this discomfort or distress on my own. She'll solve that for me.
And I think when we move into boys not knowing how to do that, you say in the book that they will then transfer it from their moms to their girlfriend.
Yes.
And then they'll transfer that to their wives. And I work with a lot of men who don't know how to regulate for themselves, and they manage their stress all day long. And then their spouse or even their children become the outlet for their stress, whether that is that they blow up and they have this kind of dad's just grumpy, or dad's got this frowny face when he walks in the door. And that's just always, or even worse, there's an expectation that the wife will be the one who absorbs all of the stress and has to process for the husband, and then has no one to process with for herself. And then that becomes a lonely place for mom. That becomes a lonely place for the wife. And men, and specifically men who are listening to this podcast, here's the question: do you expect other people in your life to manage your stress for you?
Yes.
And if you do, that's got to change.
Indeed, it does. In fact, can I tell you the worst version I've heard of that in years? I actually heard last week. I talk in terms of the statistics about how the current stat, I can't even believe this is true, what I'm about to say, but it is. The current stat is that one male dies by suicide globally on average every minute. Every minute, one man dies by suicide, one male does. And I heard a story last week. The stats are so high on college age young adult males, young men in the 18 to 25 space in particular. Although I have never in the last decade of my work seen as many adult men fathers who have died by suicide, and the wreckage that leaves on the other side for a wife and children. But back to this story, this young man was a college student at a school in the Southeast. And before he died by suicide, he texted his last two girlfriends to say, "You are responsible for this." I mean, he put all of that responsibility. I mean, that's to me the most extreme and unhealthy and heartbreaking example of what it looks like when we don't teach the 3 R's right there. I mean, that's regulate and repair right there. Like, I'm going to put all this blame on you. The fact that I'm so heartbroken over these last two breakups, I can't deal with my distress right now. So I'm going to leave this world and put all that on you. And that to me is an obviously extreme example of anchoring. But if we reel that back, I could give you everyday examples. I tell a story in the book of a mom who went into a counseling session with her husband and their therapist and had discovered a couple of days prior that her husband was in a sexual relationship with another woman, and confronted him and said, "I found a letter in your sock drawer." And his first response was, "What were you doing in my sock drawer?" Not taking any ownership of the fact that he was being unfaithful in his marriage, like starting with pointing the finger outward. Like, what were you doing snooping around?
You just shouldn't have looked there.
Absolutely. And again, that instinct is so strong in boys. Equally so in girls. I'm every bit as concerned about how many moms I'll sit with who are pointing the finger at themselves too much of the time. I sit with moms every day whose kids are struggling, many times because they just haven't had enough skill development or practice in skill development, who are like, "David, tell me what I'm doing wrong. Tell me what I'm not giving him enough of." It's this sense of you're responsible. It's like, so that blame in either direction, blaming myself or blaming others too much, is not helpful. And we've got to, again, work within that second R to develop those skills, those healthy emotional skills that every one of us is going to be using all throughout life.
So I really appreciate that perspective. To just say to moms that are listening right now, you are not responsible for the emotional response of your son. You are not responsible, but you're responsible for your emotional response to his behavior. And you can model that well. If you're like, "What can I do?" Hey, work on you. Work on your regulation. Are you taking time to breathe? Are you going through some of the same practices? Because he's watching you in that too. And I will touch on, just because I just had this conversation a few days ago with someone who found out that a significant other was acting out in some serious sexually destructive behavior on the internet. Not just looking at porn, but like creating it, and the sexting going back and forth. And I cannot tell you how many times I have heard this in one fashion or another, where the man is confronted and he says something, and this is going to be a little crass, but I'll say it just because it needs to be said. Well, if you would just put out more,
Yes,
I wouldn't have to look at this. And that is the weakest statement a man can make.
Yes.
I mean, that is anchoring to a T.
It is. Absolutely.
And
let's call it exactly what it is.
It's anchoring. And
Yes.
so, and just in case you're wondering and you're listening on this and you're working through your own addictions or your own tendencies, if you ever made that statement, that is worth an apology. Because that was on you. That was not on them. You don't get to blame that on anybody else. And I think that's just really important because those are the conversations that I think men need to have with other men, and they need to have so that their sons can listen and their sons can observe. And you talk about the importance of campouts, campfire conversations in your book. And I just want to share just this story with you because it was really impactful for me. I went through this whole book with a group of men that are in my life, and we decided we were going to do a camp out. And a friend of mine has some property, and so we had dirt bikes and we had 22s, and someone came out and they brought all the ammo, and we were shooting and riding bikes, and we tented out on the property, and then we all sat around a campfire, and we just kept it really simple. And everybody went around and shared one fear that they had. Just what is one fear that you have? And I'll never forget, I'm sitting next to my son. He's sitting next to another man. This man says, I'm afraid that I'm going to fail as a father. And my son said, I'm afraid of homework. Now, my son is almost 8 now. And I chuckle at that a little bit because I thought for a minute, I'm like, okay, he's not taking this seriously. But then I took a moment to step back and just ask the question, what's at the root of all of that? Failure.
Yes.
Like, my friend is afraid he's going to fail as a dad. And my son is afraid of homework because he doesn't like making mistakes. And it's hard to do the work. And he doesn't want to fail. And in that moment, I mean, I was like, I had tears in my eyes while I'm drinking an ice cold beverage, looking at the fire. And I'm just like, I want my son to be around other men, not just me, but around other men that are willing to do this. And you talk about that too, when you touch on pace setters. I think that's a great way for us to just kind of end our time. Just share with us a little bit about the importance of pace setters in a young boy's life.
It was one of my favorite sections of the book to write, honestly. And I was introduced, I'd love to take credit for this concept, but I will not. I cannot. I was introduced to this concept. Once upon a time, I was a runner. No one would call me that in this day and age. But once upon a time I was, and I managed to raise 3 runners. All 3 of my kids ran cross country and track. And my sons, my twin boys, had a coach who introduced them to a remarkable man that I wrote about by the name of Eliud Kipchoge. And there is a fantastic documentary that was made about his life called Kipchoge that I would highly recommend you look up. And his story is simply fascinating. He developed into this one of the world's greatest runners out of having to run to school as a young Kenyan raised by a single mother. And one of the things that he developed within his practice of becoming the world's fastest marathoner is this concept of pace setters, this concept of other men who would run with him and around him. And you get an opportunity not just to learn and hear about this, but to see it. It's fascinating to see visually. In fact, I'd encourage folks to even Google his name, and there's some great short YouTube videos where you can watch this formation of individuals running around him, and different groups of them would come in and out of his experience throughout the 26 miles, which to me was such imagery as I think about running the race of life and different individuals who come in and out of our lives. I think about teachers and coaches who played foundational roles in my life in my first 18 years. And then I think about a campus minister in my early 20s. And I think about some of my best friends who were groomsmen in my wedding, who I didn't even know when I was little, like all these different people who come into our lives in different seasons and who helped Elliot in the experience of running keep pace so that he didn't go out too fast or be running too slow midway through the race, so that he could make that ending time, so that we could, to think about reflecting on scripture, finish the race strong. And when I think about that imagery, it really does almost move me to tears. And I think about the pace setters in my own life. I could name them right now. I was just with one this morning. I have a dear friend who's exactly a decade older than me, who I've been walking with for 30 years now, and who is, a season ahead of me in parenting. He was, I had elementary age kids when he had college kids. And so it was this opportunity throughout my life for someone ahead of me, someone who's outpacing me, where I could ask questions, where I could, to your beautiful story, name my fears. And I simply want to say to you, as I reflect on all that, I don't think there is any way for you to know the impact, the significance of the impact in what you have created. And the thought of those boys and those men around a fire together, that does move me to tears. And the thought of them being able to sit front row, as we've been talking, and see adult men naming their fears, saying, this world is going to convince you that your responsibility is to be competent, appear competent, and feel competent in all moments, which you and I know is so not the game and so not possible. And then I think because boys buy into that cultural message, they then feel like, what's wrong with me? That everybody around me looks like they've got it going on. And I am just full of fear and insecurity and uncertainty and confusion and all those normal emotional experiences. But because we don't name that enough, we don't give boys enough permission and space. They think something's wrong with me when everything is right with them in those moments. They just need the space and the safety to name that. And you created that in such a beautiful, sacred way. And so it is one extension of, as I said on the front side of our conversation, this good work that you are doing in this world. You are doing this life-giving work in this world. And I am honored that you would invite me into conversation around that for a few minutes. I cannot thank you enough.
Well, I know for me personally, the conversation with David was so helpful and enlightening. And if you were intrigued by what he had to share, I want to encourage you to go and get his book. You can get a link to it in the podcast comments below. And we would love to help continue this conversation by facilitating some questions that you have. If you've got anything that you'd like to share, send us an email to chaplaincy@fearlessfollower.org. That's chaplaincy@fearlessfollower.org. And in the next coming episodes, I'm going to be interviewing some of my friends who have read through Raising Emotionally Strong Boys. And we're going to talk about how that's impacted us as husbands and as fathers, and how that's impacted us as men who don't always deal with our emotions well and are learning to do that in a helpful way. So if this has been helpful for you, we'd love for you to keep the conversation going. Listen in for the next couple of episodes. And if you work for a company where you'd like to learn more about emotional health in the workplace, or you think that your company would benefit from a conversation like the one that we just had with David Thomas, we'd love to engage with you. You can find more about us at fearlesschaplaincy.org, or you can send us an email to chaplaincy@fearlessfollower.org. And we'd love to come in and talk a little bit about how we can explore better emotional and spiritual health and wellness on the job. Again, my name's Josh. It's been great talking with you, and we'll see you next time.